But before we talk about the immune responses, we have to understand that the cells which cells are involved in the immune system. And so when we're talking about lymphocytes, we're talking about B cells and T cells. When it comes to B cells and plasma cells, these B cells secrete antibodies, which are proteins that bind to antigens. Well, what's an antigen? An antigen is a chemical structure on the surface of a pathogen, and these are recognized by receptors on B and T cells. And so these B cells recognize the antigens and then make antibodies. These B cells can differentiate into plasma cells, which secrete a ton of antibodies. And we'll get to more about that in a little bit, but just understand that B cells are what help generate antibodies to fight off pathogens containing antigens. And then T cells and NK cells. So T cells are the other type of lymphocyte I was talking about. They have a role in adaptive immunity, and they secrete chemical messengers. These chemical messengers help warn everybody else, all the other cells involved, that there's an immune response that's needed, and helps cascade that event. Natural killer cells, or NK cells, these are involved in the innate immune response, and they're the first line of defense against viruses. And so here's a nice little table, kind of generally saying what the primary function of those cells would be, even though I spelled function wrong apparently. So, the immune system is a collection of barriers, cells, and soluble proteins that interact and communicate with each other in very complex ways. The three temporal phases that have different effects consist of the following. We have the innate immune response that has two of them, and we have the adaptive immune response. The barrier defenses, such as skin and mucous membranes, act instantaneously to prevent pathogenic invasion into the body tissues. And then the rapid but non-specific innate immune response is kind of, it consists of a variety of specialized cells and soluble factors, but together with the barrier defenses, this makes up the innate immune system. And so you have your adaptive immune system or response, you have your innate immune system or response. And within the innate immune response or system, you have two aspects. So the immune system that has evolved to slow pathogen invasion until the adaptive immune system can build its arsenal is this innate immune response. So so this entire system, the innate immune response with the barrier defenses and the rapid but non-specific innate immune response is basically to slow the pathogen's progression in the body until the adaptive immune response can help out. And this adaptive immune response is slower but more specific and effective, and it involves many different types of cells and soluble factors, and primarily is controlled by white blood cells known as the lymphocytes, which help control immune responses. And so the first line of defense is those surface barriers. Those are the skin and mucous membranes. They constitute a physical barrier, so your skin is physical, right? You have to go through the skin in order to get there, and also a chemical barrier. This is the pH of the skin, being a little bit more acidic than the bacteria, as well as the vagina, sebum, and your mucus. These are all more acidic pH-wise than bacteria, so they help inhibit the bacterial growth. The stomach mucosa is acidic and also digestive, so it's pH 2, so it's very, very strong, so it helps break down some of those before they even make it into the small intestine to be mounting an immune response. Salivary and lacrimal glands have lysozymes in them, so they can help have a different pH than bacteria, and then they break down pathogens coming in. Think lyso as lysing or breaking, exploding, enzymes as an enzyme, so they're literally exploding enzymes, help go around chunking stuff up, pathogens coming in, help break it up. And then mucus traps microbes in the digestive and respiratory tracts. So this first line of defense, think of it as your skin and mucus. The second line of defense involves internal cellular entities, and so think of this as internal defenses. So NK cells are a type of lymphocyte that have the ability to induce apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. And they do this in cells infected with intracellular pathogens such as obligate intracellular bacteria and also viruses. Natural killer cells recognize those cells by mechanisms that we still don't understand very well, but they presumably involve their surface receptors somehow to recognize them. Natural killer cells also they induce apoptosis, in which a cascade of events inside the cell causes its own programmed death. So many of the cells in the immune system have a phagocytic ability, at least at some point during their life cycles. Phagocytosis is really important and effective as a mechanism for destroying pathogens during an innate immune response. The phagocyte takes the organism inside itself as a phagosome, which subsequently fuses with the lysosome and its digestive enzymes, which we learned about in our cell chapters, and that effectively kills many of the pathogens. And the macrophages and neutrophils are what make up the major phagocytes in these internal defenses. And so you can see phagocytes here. And the hallmark of the innate immune response is inflammation. So inflammation is something that everyone has experienced. You stub a toe, cut a finger, do any activity that causes tissue damage, and inflammation will result with its 4 characteristics: heat, redness, pain, and swelling, potentially even loss of function. It's important to note that inflammation does not have to be initiated by an infection, but can also be caused by tissue injuries. So we learned about that with the hemostasis that we were looking at last week. The release of damaged cellular contents into the site of injury is enough to stimulate the response, even in the absence of breaks and physical barriers that would allow pathogens to enter, such as hitting your thumb with a hammer. The inflammatory reaction brings in phagocytic cells to the damaged area to clear cellular debris and to set the stage for wound repair. So that's exactly what we're kind of seeing here. This third line of defense is adaptive immunity. So the innate immune responses and early induced responses are in many cases ineffective at completely controlling pathogen growth. However, they slow pathogen growth and allow time for the adaptive immune system or response to strengthen and either control or eliminate the pathogen. The innate immune system also sends signals to the cells of the adaptive immune system, guiding them in how to attack the pathogen. Thus, these are the 2 important arms of the immune response. There are 3 aspects to the adaptive immune system that makes it unique from the innate immune responses. First is it is antigen specific. So the B cells will target specific foreign substances, which is different than the innate immune system that utilizes pH to kill any bacterial invader, or NK cells to eat up anything that is recognized as foreign. Another aspect of adaptive immunity is that it is not region-specific, so it's systemic. It does not only occur at the site where the infection started. The whole lymphatic system gets involved with the adaptive immune response, since it involves the B and T cells circulating in the lymph. The last aspect to the adaptive immunity is that it utilizes memory of previously recognized antigens to provide a preparatory line of defense in case the antigen was ever encountered again. So this is what is known as humoral immunity. The immune system's first exposure to a pathogen is called the primary adaptive response, this whole block over here. Symptoms of the first infection, called the primary disease, are always relatively severe because it takes time for an initial adaptive immune response to a pathogen to become effective. Upon re-exposure to the same pathogen, a secondary adaptive immune response is generated, which is stronger and faster than the primary response. The secondary adaptive response often eliminates a pathogen before it can even cause significant tissue damage or any symptoms. Without symptoms, there is no disease, and the individual is not even aware of the infection. The secondary response is the basis of immunological memory, which protects us from getting diseases repeatedly from the same pathogen. And by this mechanism, an individual's exposure to pathogens early in life spares the person from these diseases later in life. So the process of humoral immunity or immunological memory is you have these B cells that have the antigen receptors. So they have receptors for recognizing antigens from different pathogens. These B cells will make contact with those antigens and then be activated. That will then make them secrete antibodies. And so the secretion of these antibodies is done by these plasma cells. So basically think of it as this B cell binds to antibodies and then differentiates into a plasma cell, and then it makes antibodies, some antibodies. But then one of those B cells might differentiate it will just clone itself instead of differentiating into a plasma cell. And then that clone will keep making more clones and then make a bunch of plasma cells and make a bunch of antibodies. But this takes time. So the primary response makes a little bit, and the secondary response makes a lot. And so as you'll see from this figure, the primary response to an antigen from a pathogen is delayed by several days. And so think of this as 1 to 15 days, and then another 15 days, but the amount of response is significantly higher than this first response. And this is the time that it takes for B cells to make clones to expand and differentiate into plasma cells. And the second time a person encounters that same antigen, there's no time delay, and the amount of antibody made is much higher. Thus, the secondary antibody response overwhelms the pathogens quickly, and in most situations, no symptoms are even felt. So it takes a long time for this one to mount, and it's not very much. The concentration of antibodies is not very high. Then it comes down, and then we have another exposure, and bam, we have a ton, almost 3 times as much, and in a lesser time than this one took. And so that secondary immune response is significantly stronger because it remembered those antibodies from this one, but those antibodies took time to produce, and they prepared it for the future. So that was based off of that humoral immunity. And this is the basis of vaccines, which are immunizations. They provide tools for the body to use as a template for recognition. So they'll use a living or an attenuated virus, which is basically it's alive, but they took its viral components out so that it can't hurt you, but it's alive, so your body will recognize it as a virus, and then it'll make antibodies for that, so that if you end up coming in contact with the actual virus outside of, in a different situation, your body would be able to mount that secondary immune response instead of a primary immune response upon the actual exposure to the pathogen. The same thing happens with the dead virus. And so it's got its viral components, but it's dead, so it can't do anything. Your body recognizes it as a pathogen and builds antibodies to it. So this vaccine is basically the primary response, and it's cheating the system, kind of, evolutionarily speaking. And it's a form of active artificial immunity. And so vaccines are pretty cool when it comes to that. But that actually is all we have for the immune system and the lymphatic system.